And welcome back. Usually environmentalists and forest companies are locked in battle, but a new deal to save large swaths of Canadian forests may have produced a truce. In exchange for giving up logging the trees, environmentalist groups will ease up on their boycotting activities. CTV's Danielle Hamanjuan has more.
They're calling it a truce in the Battle of the Boreal. At stake, 70 million hectares of forest spanning from BC to Newfoundland. And after decades of feuding, an agreement.
This is the largest of its kind anywhere on the planet.
On one side, nearly 24 forestry companies will suspend logging and road building on roughly 40% of the land.
There will be permanently protected areas within it, and they will be protected permanently. There will be areas in which we are going to continue operations.
9 environmental groups on their end will suspend boycott campaigns like this one. A full-page ad in the New York Times bashing lingerie giant Victoria's Secret for using pulp from endangered forests for their catalogs.
To be able to sell their products in the marketplace free of conflict, free of controversy.
And freedom for what is at the heart of this pact. The iconic woodland caribou, which is in danger of disappearing because of too much disturbance. They say the caribou are barometers for healthy forests. Down by half, there are 36,000 remaining. Saving the boreal will ensure their survival.
It'll be difficult for people to campaign against forest products in Canada when they see that the environmental movement is saying, okay, this makes sense.
The boreal is a source of fresh water and of billions of dollars in products sold around the world. Both sides say this is a win-win situation. The forestry companies going green is good for their image, while environmentalists say this is their best chance to save the boreal. A simple plan they hope will set the bar for a new global standard. Danielle Hamanjuan, CTV News, Ottawa.
As you just heard, it's being hailed as an historic agreement to save large swaths of forests across Canada. But some First Nation critics say it's another example of an old colonial mindset. They are criticizing the deal, saying there was no consultation with First Nation communities whose land includes forest covered under the deal. Clayton Thomas Mueller is with the Indigenous Environmental Network. He joins us from Ottawa. Thank you very much for joining us, Clayton. On the surface, this sounds like a good agreement. What are your concerns about it?
Well, I think that, like similar regional land use planning frameworks like the Great Bear Rainforest, this is, of course, at an unparalleled scale. The concerns that I've heard expressed, of course, are in today's announcement at the high-profile press conference held by the proponents of this development, were the fact that there were no First Nations present. Members of this coalition, on this conservation deal are working with a handful of First Nations who come from communities whose lands have been decimated by the forestry sector. However, these communities cannot be negotiating national conservation policy on behalf of over 600 sovereign First Nations. Each of these communities, especially communities that have intact forests of which they depend on for subsistence and other cultural needs.
How do you think such a seemingly landmark agreement reached a point of conclusion without serious input from First Nations?
Well, if you look at what they're saying in the press release, they've highlighted a fact that they are committed to working with various stakeholders, governments, and as well as First Nations. But, again, the entire framework was negotiated between environmental NGOs represented in this coalition and the forestry sector. Meanwhile, in places like Grassy Narrows, Temagami, Barrier Lake First Nations, these communities continue to have their lands decimated, by companies like Weyerhaeuser. And we have to be cautious about the fact as well that this agreement is a precursor to a forest offsets program here in Canada, which commodifies the boreal forest and turns it into a commodity to be bought and sold on carbon trading markets to offset developments like Canada's tar sands and the mega mining explosion that's taking place across this country. And so the forestry companies that are a part of this agreement agreement are, stand to make millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in carbon credits from not cutting down the stands in the 29 million hectares that they're, proposing to conserve. They also stand to make even more money by clear-cutting the land in places like tar sands, where the rate of deforestation is second only to the Amazon rainforest. And so we're highly concerned about the nature of this agreement, about the lack of representation of First Nations peoples who should be driving conservation in Canada, considering we're the ones who live in the places where resources like the boreal forest exist.
And finally, what impact do you think that this agreement will have on First Nation communities that are trying to stop logging their territories? There's Grassy Narrow in Ontario, Okanagan Indian Band in BC. How will this embolden forestry firms?
Well, again, we heard it today from the mouth of the representative of the Forest Partnership Agreement. They said, if you want to take us on now, you're going to have to take on our gang, which, includes organizations like Greenpeace, like Forest Ethics and others. And I mean, essentially what this agreement has done is it's isolated even further the First Nations who are most vulnerable to the impacts of unsustainable forest development to be even more isolated because they were never at the table to begin with. And so I think the public in Canada, especially our Aboriginal leadership, needs to be highly critical about this agreement, needs to question why our sovereign nations were not at the table from the get-go, and and be very critical about attempts by the Forest Partnership Agreement and by this coalition in selling a deal to them that they had no part in creating.
What would make it a better deal?
I think, what it comes down to is that the legality of this deal, in my opinion, is in question. There are so many areas in the boreal forest that are in litigation, that are in, land claims process that have not been settled in terms of, Aboriginal title. And so to go and say, hey, we're going to conserve 50% of the boreal forest and the other 50% is open for sale is absolutely absurd. And quite frankly, it's illegal given the current status of Aboriginal land claims in this country. And so I think what would make it a better deal is that, First Nations peoples have to lead these types of agreements because, these are not just empty wildernesses. These are places where our ancestors are buried. These are places where our people continue to utilize the land. And these are places where our people have a sacred relationship with Mother Earth. And therefore, we need to be the ones, the bosses.
Thank you very much for your time, Clayton.
Thank you for having me.
Harvest